So go and watch that. And now we're going to move on and talk briefly about the agents of socialization. So these are the people, groups, and institutions that shape our self concept, our beliefs, and our behavior. And while there are lots of agents of socialization, we're just going to talk about family, peers, school, and the media and how they shape who we are. So, of course, the first one, the family, is the most important agent of socialization, especially to young children. So, parents minister to the baby's needs by feeding, cleaning, caring, and comforting. The lifelong process of learning begins shortly after birth. So, basic skills that we take for granted and as natural, but that we learn thanks to our families, are infinite. So, because it's such a small and intimate group, the family is very effective at primary socialization. Families instill our values, beliefs, behavioral norms that tend to persist throughout our lives. From our family, we're also given our socioeconomic status. So things like our race, our ethnic identity, religious and moral beliefs, all sorts of stuff is passed to us from generation to generation. As a child grows older, peers become the most important and increasingly relevant agent of socialization. So, as a child grows older, the family becomes somewhat less important, and peer groups increasingly assume the role of what we might call Mede's significant others. So, the peer group helps you separate from your parents and become involved in wider society, develop some independence. And within your peer group, young people tend to associate with people who are approximately their own age, enjoy a similar social status, have things in common, and there's a lot of growth that occurs through the peer phase of the peer phase of socialization. The next one that we're going to talk about is school. So schools teach us basic skills. They teach us reading, writing, math, all of the academics. But they also teach us things like shared cultural knowledge, like the national anthem, the prime minister, principles of good character, and they provide both social order and individual opportunity. But something about school is that it can also reinforce existing inequality because school is based on a system of rules that reinforces certain behaviors that can reflect a certain level of privilege. So, a quote about school that we could say schools produce teachable students who become manageable workers. So, think about that for a second. Is that the purpose of school? Something that I find interesting is what's called the hidden curriculum in school. So, the hidden curriculum goes beyond the official curriculum to examine the moral and informal lessons that we learned in the classroom and on the playground about how we should behave and what we should think, all sorts of stuff. So, school is really interesting to sort of analyze its contribution to who we are and what we find valuable. And the last agent of socialization that we're going to look at is the media. Increasingly, the media is something that socializes us, that passes on messages to us about how we think we should be. And content often reflects widespread societal values because it is intended to appeal to mass audiences. But the pervasiveness of social media also shapes, perpetuates, and changes those values. So, especially now with the advent of social media, so these are, as you know, forms of electronic communication such as blogs, forums, podcasts, and sites for social networking through which users can create and share information, ideas, and personal messages. Mass media's traditional audience was really passive. So people would sit and watch TV, listen to the radio, or read the newspaper, and they would simply be given messages that they had no interaction with. But now we have what we might even call a citizen media. So we have a lot of content that's created by private citizens. There's a lot of interaction that occurs now. Even when you're watching TV and you've got the little like Twitter scroll on the bottom that's going across your favorite show, this is sort of a new phenomenon, as I'm sure you know. But it's really interesting in how it's changed the amount of information we take in, the reflection of things that are good, bad, things that we should care about or whatever is passed to us through all these different forms of media that are sort of taking over our lives. So the next portion of the chapter is really interesting and it has to do with re-socialization. So, as I mentioned, socialization goes on throughout the life course, and sometimes we re socialize ourselves. So, this is the process of learning new norms, values, and attitudes and behaviors and abandoning some of the old ones. So, there are very specific scenarios in which a process of re socialization might take place. Sort of a more I guess you could say everyday example would be let's say a woman who was a housewife, her husband worked, and she did not say they get divorced. Having to become a single mom, re enter the workplace, this could be described as re socialization, learning new norms, values, attitudes, and behaviors, and abandoning the old ones. Um, we're going to look at an example of resocialization that takes place in total institutions. So these can be a little bit more extreme and less everyday examples, but are still really interesting. So, total institutions are places in which the most effective forms of resocialization can occur because they're completely isolated from outside influences and can be more easily reformed or controlled. So, on the first kind of title page of the chapter, they talk about the military. And I thought this was really interesting too because they say how young people are more easily adaptable and are taken the values of the military more easily than older recruits do, and how boot camp and all the things that they go through in initiating themselves are a part of discarding old norms, values, attitudes, and behaviors and learning the new ones that make them effective members of that community. Of course, a classic example of total institutions is prison. So, the characteristics of what makes something a total institution is that there's one authority and activities take place in specific locations. Number two, carefully structured activities control the participants. Number three, authorities are carefully screening all the information from outside the institution. Number four, rules and roles are clearly defined. Number five, a strict hierarchy exists within the institution. And number six, total institutions restrict individual choices. So, yes, we can think of total institutions as things that are punitive, like prison or a mental health institution. But we can also think of them as um, less, punishing. Like something, for example, a summer camp could be thought of as a total institution. Or being on a cruise ship could be an example of a total institution. So they're not necessarily punishing, but the example that you can watch in the PowerPoint slides uploaded to DC Connect is about a prison, and it's actually from Kingston Penitentiary before it was closed. And it's really interesting because it's interviews with past inmates who detail the extreme strictness of being in a maximum security prison, especially one that's really really outdated. So yeah, super interesting. You should watch it and pay attention to some of the characteristics of the total institutions in the video. Um, and consider, have you ever been in one? Have you ever worked in one or will work in one? And what might that be like? So yeah, the Tales from Kingston Pen little mini documentary. The first 10 minutes are probably all you'd really need in order to reinforce the concepts, but feel free to watch the whole thing. Um, and they talk about what they wore, what the guards were like, a degradation ceremony that again sort of strips their old self and leaves them open to adopting new behaviors. Really interesting stuff. So let's talk for a minute about how each of the sociological perspectives might think about socialization. So, symbolic interactionists, of course, focus on how the process of socialization takes place between individuals and within small groups. And in your book, they use a running example throughout the perspectives of schooling. So, if a symbolic interactionist were studying socialization taking place in schools, they might look at the interactions with teachers and students, how a teacher might how their expectations might influence student performance, self-image, other stuff like that. They would highlight communication, the use of symbols, and the interpretation of the messages by the individuals as they're internalizing and learning the various aspects of culture. A functionalist would examine how institutions such as religion and education perform a socialization function in society. So, again, those major institutions. And they'd say that socialization is important to functionalists because it helps to pass on cultural norms and values. This increases predictability and efficiency, and it maintains social stability. So, in the school, a functionalist would look at the formal curriculum that's taught, the subjects, their content, the functions that they fulfill in order to create good workers, good students. And they would also look at how they transmit knowledge, like norms and values of a particular society, and again, how these things help to maintain stability. Conflict theorists take the view that socialization teaches and reproduces social inequality. So, socialization through not just genetics or through the family passes on and reinforces people who have opportunity and privilege and maintains people who don't have those in their social positions. So, again, the conflict theorist is always looking at who has what and why. So they would say that socialization maintains the social, political, and economic advantages of the dominant class. And in our schooling example, they'd argue that schools sort children along class lines, that certain behaviors, attitudes, opportunities, etc., that are more reflective of certain classes are more rewarded than others. And they'd also say that schools socialize those in working classes to accept their positions as lower class members of society. The feminist theory, again, focuses on inequalities between men and women. This inequality is not natural, it's often the result of socialization. So the messages that we've been given throughout our entire lives about who men are and who women are, that's gender socialization. So this teaches us about the attitudes and behavior that society defines as appropriate for each of the genders. So gender and education, in our example, they'd say that gender socialization takes place in the classroom from a micro perspective, and that how the teacher treats the boys and the girls and all the things that go on between students in the schoolyard is reinforcing, perpetuating gender inequality. And maybe from a macro perspective, the feminist theory might analyze how female students are more prevalent in certain fields of study and less prevalent in other fields of study, such as science, technology, engineering, and math. So that's something that would be of interest to a feminist theorist. And on one of our last slides here, you have some really interesting examples of gender socialization, how we learn to become who we are, what's expected of us based on our gender. You can click right on those in the PowerPoint slides. So the first one is a funny little BuzzFeed video about how ridiculous it seems to enforce gender norms on adults the same way we do to children. So think about the preferences for blue and pink and all that sort of silly stuff. And then we've got a particular example for both boys and girls. For girls, this is a trailer for the documentary called Misrepresentation that has to do with how girls are potentially socialized by the media, having to do with body image and all that sort of stuff. And it's super interesting. Lots of good cameos by lots of famous people in that documentary. And then on the other side, we have an example for the boys. So when you click on that Kickstarter project, you have to go to sort of its main page. So you might just have to click over one page in order to find the video, the trailer for the movie called The Mask You Live In, which is kind of like echoes misrepresentation in the sense that it has to do with masculinity and how boys are often encouraged to act macho and tough and not express their feelings, and how this is really damaging to men's health and men's mental health. So again, it has a lot to do with the messages that we receive as children about what's expected of us based on our gender. And keep that in mind this week for your quiz as well. So, how does understanding socialization help us improve our society? So, Comte, classical sociologist and the founder of sociology, urged us to use our knowledge about society to help improve society. So, lawmakers have used that philosophy to enact various social policies, and social policies are deliberate strategies that are designed to correct recognized social problems. So they give this example on the last page of the chapter with the 1982 Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and how this might be considered one such attempt to implement sociological knowledge in order to help improve our society and make Canada a better place. Okay, so that is the end of our socialization lecture, and this is only a 1 week topic, which means this is only the only week that there's going to be content released for socialization. Although next week is reading week, so that means the mission tasks for this chapter aren't actually due for 2 weeks until the February 28th at 11:59 p.m. So it's due before our next class together. And since we don't have class next week for reading week, it's the week after. So if your game, the article quiz, and the 5% chapter quiz, and all of this will be summarized in a reminder next week and the week after as well. So let me know if you have any questions, and thanks so much. I'll talk to you soon.